Howdy folks, I'm Chris. Welcome to talk today about healing power of nature and nature therapy. Let's see what's going on here. I'd like to share some of my slides with you all, see if I can manage the technology. There we go. So welcome. I've been here at Sierra Tucson as the program manager for the Experiential Therapies program for about 5 years. I started off as an adventure therapist here with them about 7 years ago. My day-to-day involves typically adventure therapy, some nature-based therapy groups, and occasional equine therapy as well. I've been doing this work for more than 25 years now. I started off with wilderness therapy back in the early 90s, working predominantly with adjudicated youth and younger people, and then got more involved with backcountry pre-hospital care, search and rescue, that sort of thing. But then I experienced a life-changing injury and had to adjust my focus. I went back to school, started studying human behavior, environmental psychology, how people engage with and perceive the environment, and kind of led me to this work very much through my own personal experience, my own personal healing. And so I feel obviously strongly about this work and feel like it's a opportunity for me to share some of that passion and connect folks with what I do, and maybe see if there's an opportunity for you to do some of that. Feel like my webcam has dropped off. And that's okay, because I didn't really want you guys to be looking at me the whole time anyway, but I'll bring my image back up at the end when we do the question and answer process here. So there we go. Healing power of nature. We'll be talking specifically about nature therapy. There's a lot of terms associated with this, some of which have specific definitions, and some of which have kind of more useful functional and somewhat mutable, changeable definitions in the process. But the intention here is really to talk about and connect you with some of the mechanisms by which nature therapy works. My intention for what we're going to try and cover here today is specifically the justification for nature-based therapeutics, the traditional or the historic foundation, kind of the modern background for nature therapy, attention restoration and stress reduction. So this term biophilia, which some folks may be very familiar with, and some folks this is a new term, but kind of the foundation and mechanism by which so much of this works. Place-based versus activity-based programming. So what is the real modality that we're trying to engage here? And then integration into treatment modalities, hopefully to share with you all some ways that this can be connected with your practice, both professionally and personally. There is an opportunity here for us to connect with a couple of these things here. I gotta apologize. I never like Zoom processes because I can't see anybody's faces or get any kind of backdrop there. So I'm operating my own little bubble for a moment here, and I'm going to try and do my best to slow down and think about or anticipate how people might interpret me somewhat differently. Obviously, there'll be an opportunity at the questions at the end for you to hold me accountable for the things that I say here. But let me just touch on some definitions here. And I know a lot of people have strong reaction to folks reading slides as they're presented, and I get that, especially when it comes to definitions. I think there's worthwhile for me to read it out loud because I want you to read it and have your connection there at the same time. That said, I apologize if it's triggered. Nature therapy, there's a couple different definitions out there because it can be a grab bag of some different practices that connect or interconnect, if you will. But two functional ones that I found out there that I kind of like: therapeutic approaches that incorporate nature as a major component, or referred to as nature-based therapies. and can include adventure therapy, wilderness therapy, ecotherapy, eco-psychology, nature-assisted therapy, and nature-guided therapy. There's more terms too. Another definition out there, nature therapy, NT, includes a variety of nature-based therapeutic approaches which offer opportunities for personal growth, development, and self-actualization, specifically among adults and the general public. So the operative term here is nature. Utilizing nature and nature awareness is really the functional and operative knowledge here, that nature is incorporated into the process and incorporated into people's individual awareness there. Some of the practices that use nature therapy are listed up there. There's a number of other ones as well that may attach onto here. Equine therapy, horticultural therapy. These are practices that actively engage the understanding of nature in the therapeutic process and directly connect with that. Each of those tend to have some much more specific definitions. So as an adventure therapist, I subscribe to some very specific definitions of what's adventure therapy and therefore what isn't adventure therapy. Same with equine therapy and some of the other ones that I practice. But the understanding here with nature therapy is that connection of different processes that utilize, connect with, and have a active awareness of nature in the processing. So like anything else in therapy, there's that conversation of what's the difference between therapeutic and therapy. And nature therapy differentiates specifically from time and nature in that idea that it is a specifically targeted therapy modality. The idea being that it meets these criteria of being professionally directed, goal-directed, part of a treatment plan, and of course, the bane of my existence, documentation. The idea being that there are plenty of practices that people may have as part of their self-care regimen, as part of their cultural or personal lifestyle that involve nature and may have multiple and significant benefits. But that is differentiated from therapy in that it has that professional direction and a treatment diagnosis that it's specifically targeted towards treating. The idea being that all of us should probably go for walks in the woods to clear our head and connect with it. But if one is seeking a particular goal, then there may be some awarenesses, practices, and therefore leading to goals in a treatment plan that can be documented going forward that differentiate it from recreation, self-care, and like I said, cultural, personal kind of practices there. That idea of recreation in the form of recreation is strong in the nature therapy awareness. All of us have certain practices that we find to be supportive. And the idea of incorporating this in here is certainly something I advocate, time and nature. But I want to make sure that there's a distinction in people's mind between nature therapy and just a walk in the woods. Although working, so this is kind of the justification or the motivation for me to give this talk with you all, is this idea that I'd like there to be a greater awareness of nature therapy with other practitioners. The idea that this is not just a good idea, but a therapeutic modality and awareness that can both drive a treatment plan and impact directly the client's recovery is something that I think is of critical awareness. And so the idea of working with nature, incorporating nature, and having that awareness, even if you're not somebody who is going to consider yourself a nature therapist, is certainly something that I want to advocate for, because this overall process, and especially when I start talking about the concept of biophilia, this overall process can be deeply impactful and something that if one seize the opportunity to use, I certainly want there to be a wider awareness and connection with that process. So whether an overt part of therapy or simply a subtle influence, humans are impacted in many ways by their environment. Nature therapy can be viewed as an adjunct therapy or an awareness of the human condition. So how do we come about to nature therapy? Where are we at in this day and age? I think you could certainly there's absolutely a background in pretty much all cultures of having a connection to the land. But the thing we need to recognize here is that in a single lifespan, roughly 80 plus years, we've gone from a agrarian dominant world to a urban dominant world, with roughly 60% of the world population being defined as urban. Things have changed in the world hugely, and to anticipate that that's going to impact us environmentally, culturally, and individually is the premise for nature therapy. So practices that were part of one's culture, religion, family history, part of the world are deeply impacted by our modern existence. And for reasons one way or another, a lot of us have become disconnected from the natural environment around us. And the question is how does that impact us in our mental well-being and behavioral output there? So the idea of the modern nature therapy history book here is pretty early, pretty long-standing, but really it has an inflection point around World War II. And I'd like to just kind of talk about this so that people understand where we're coming from a modern perspective and what's the kind of underpinnings of this overall system. So I'm going to hit on a couple of high points that I think are relevant. This is certainly not an exhaustive history of nature therapy, but starting roughly with the outward bound model, acknowledging the awareness of eco-psychology, the adaptation to the Project Adventure model, biophilia, and then the modern nature therapy that many of us practice today is kind of the little journey I'd like to go on before I get into how we can apply it. So early on in World War II, a progressive educator named Kurt Hahn, kind of the school of John Dewey and Paulo Freire, much more dynamic interaction with students, the idea of dynamic education, not just being a route memorization. Kurt Hahn had some interesting boarding school models in Austria, I believe, somewhere in Central Europe there. And at the beginning of World War II, as a British citizen, he adapted his system somewhat, was contacted by the British Admiralty and encouraged to come up with a training program for the British merchant seaman program, which was suffering greatly due to U-boat attacks, World War II beginnings there, and the Lend-Lease program, where they were having all the ships they could possibly need for the war effort, but somehow with them getting sunk on a regular basis, the human resources were highly impacted. So he developed a model originally called Aberdovi, I believe, not sure about the pronunciation, which later evolved into what we call today Outward Bound. This model specifically had three critical elements in it: the physical environment, the social environment, and the individual, each of which the programming was designed to illuminate and impact in order to try and build a stronger, more resilient, more functional individual. The physical environment was mountaineering in Wales, which was a pretty austere environment, especially when you consider the lack of Gore-Tex back in the 1940s. But this was an environment that was specifically designed to challenge and expose people to natural systems, natural consequences, and something that was physically and structurally challenging for them. The social environment was this idea of group dynamics, and that they were connected to a group, a community, a society, but one with finite limits. So this encouraged coping rather than defensive behavior because you were accountable to the group. The idea of creating or strengthening initiative, cooperation, and risk-taking rather than the more negative responses of denial, withdrawal, and fight-flight responses. So the group dynamic. And then finally, the individual and the idea of changing or growing or reinforcing the individual, the idea that natural consequences reinforce adaptive behavior for the individual, and through a spectrum of experiences, both through the natural environment creating those experiences and the social dynamic creating those experiences, the individual self would be defined and revealed, building a more resilient, structural, functional person. Now, of course, this model, as effective as it was very time intensive and not something that really lends itself to the current day-to-day lives of individuals. Nonetheless, the effectiveness of it was seen manifest in so many levels, both there during World War II, but then the Outward Bound School, which first moved to the United States, the Colorado Outward Bound School, was seen as being a model for progressive education, for youth development, was, and certainly with my early exposure to it, connected with addressing maladaptive behavior in youth, young adults, that sort of thing. So incredibly effective model, but not necessarily applicable to all communities or all individuals. Building on that, a little bit later in time, Erich Fromm, roughly 73, comes up with these terms or coins the term eco-psychology. Eco-psychology studies the relationship between human beings and the natural environment through both ecological and psychological principles. Eco-psychology seeks to develop and understand ways of expanding the emotional connection between individuals and the natural environment, thereby assisting individuals with developing sustainable lifestyles and remedying, there we go, alienation from nature. So Fromm's postulating here this idea that we are deeply and inextricably connected with nature. And this concept is powerful because it's answering some of this modern disconnect. And if he was seeing it in 73, imagine what we're seeing now in 2022. As we become more urban, as we become more removed from those kind of classic survival models, and as we become more and more disconnected from the means of our own survival, from food production, seeking shelter, and those various other high-standing Maslowian concepts, we become more and more disconnected and more unaware of the direct connection with our well-being and feeling. So this idea of eco-psychology is kind of the underpinning for where we go with nature therapy, that there is a connection, and that connection is powerful. Connection is something that we can build on, that we can expose, and that we can allow individuals to engage in. So both the model, the Outward Bound system, and the eco-psychology lead us to some modern adaptations and understandings. So in the promo for this class, I listed E.O. Wilson as the one who coined biophilia, but actually it was Fromm that coined it, but it was E.O. Wilson that certainly popularized it. And E.O. Wilson was a naturalist. My own exposure to him started off early on with his essay on how to raise a naturalist. But the idea of biophilia is that we have a love for nature and that we seek a connection, and that connection is something that builds within us the ability to be at ease, at comfort, to experience positive joy and connection there. And so this, from eco-psychology, we get the term biophilia, being that love of biota, plants and animals and nature, all those wonderful things. At the same time, the Outward Bound model, as powerful as it is, went through a deconstruction process, if you will, somewhere in the 70s, where in particular focused around Project Adventure, at least at the time being an education-oriented program, that said, what if we make this more accessible? Instead of these month-long expeditions, we talk about having discrete modules that we can teach in the classroom, that we can access in shorter periods of time. Can we enable peak experience instead of summoning a mountain? Can we do some stuff on a ropes course? Can we have an experience that is more closer to home? And so the idea of it being an other and out there, a strange experience, to maybe remove some of that conflict or artifice and bring it more into the present here and now. So very much what we practice today in adventure therapy in specific, but in nature therapy and so many of its applications owes a background to Project Adventure and how we've taken kind of this critical functionalities, looking at the group dynamic, looking at the social dynamic, the environmental dynamic, and the individual, allows us to apply some of that effectiveness of the outward bound model into something that's more functional. So combination here, biophilia and functionality. That concept biophilia is something that I'm going to hit on in a few different ways, and so I encourage folks to be aware of that term, that and to maybe connect personally with your understanding of how you appreciate nature, what you're aware of, and what impact your own experiences in nature effects on your mood and outlook. So here's one of those definitions. From a nature therapy perspective, health involves being at ease, connecting to oneself and the world, experiencing and expressing the many aspects of what it means to be human. In contrast, dis-ease is experienced through separation, a disconnection from instinct, emotion, body, heart, nature, and life. The ultimate therapeutic objective of nature therapy, therefore, is to awaken and deepen the awareness of the human potential, to connect with and know self and the world in an expansive and interconnected way. So this is expanding out from that concept of biophilia, the idea of nature therapy being that connection, and that idea that energetically and emotionally, we have some of our regulation connected to, due to, impacted by our relationship with nature, our perception and our kind of unconscious feelings there associated with how this goes and how you connect with that nature. So that was one of my goals there, was to share this idea of energetic connection. This is the idea that we are part of nature and nature is part of us, and that the disconnect there, whether it's through maladaptive coping mechanisms, the things of us constantly being glued to our phones, media, and other screens, the disconnect we have with what is actively going on around us, that kind of ability to block out things that don't deeply impact us. Living here in the Sonoran Desert, having access to air conditioning, I know plenty of people that experience the summer through an entirely air-conditioned world, with bare seconds between their air-conditioned house to their air-conditioned car to their air-conditioned office, or in COVID times, their air-conditioned bedroom to their air-conditioned kitchen to their air-conditioned Zoom call. And so that disconnection from nature can create a real sense of dis-ease and disharmony that is something that can be directly addressed through connecting to the natural world around us. I think this is also a place for me to throw in the idea of the literal infinite complexity of the natural world that we can perceive. I'm reminded of a cartoon about virtual reality put together 20 years before virtual reality was a reality, in which showed a guy on a treadmill with some television screen in front of him and branches whipping by on the side of the treadmill, and then a guy with a hypodermic needle sticking him to simulate mosquito bites. Uh, we've come very far in our artificial world in creating simulation, but there is this idea of infinite complexity. Ultimately, the idea of human perception, all these artificial modalities have a finite level of resolution, and real reality does not have a finite level of resolution. You can touch, taste, smell, hear a rock. And the closer you look, the more detail is present in that process. So this idea of energetic connection and the depth of complexity are things that are going to drive the nature therapy impact on how one goes through the world. So how do we practice or use that concept of nature therapy and biophilia in practice? There are many different practices out there, and some of them have very specific mechanisms and techniques, and some of them have kind of a grab bag that fits within kind of an interconnected Venn diagram, if you will, that all overlaps over this concept of nature or natural. But I've decided to pick out a few critical components that I think can inform and support the idea of a nature therapy based practice or nature therapy aware practice going forward. Mindfulness, sensory enhancement, symbolic projection, and solitude are components that come up regularly in my practice. And I think that they relate pretty universally to a lot of other practices in behavioral health, specifically well-being and self-care. So let's talk about those a little bit. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to share a practice that I did just a week or so ago with a group here at Sierra Tucson, in which I led a group out to a section on our property and asked them to engage with, to perceive an ocotillo. Those of you who are not familiar with ocotillo, imagine a tree that Dr. Seuss designed. Long, whippy branches, 12 to 16 feet long, tipped by bright orange clustered flowers, covered in spikes all along its length, and just all around a really dynamic plant, but also exists in abundance here on our property, and something that people have looked at typically from a distance many a time, but maybe don't have that object familiarity that might lead to dismissal. So I brought a group of our clients out to an ocotillo and asked them to engage in a guided meditation process around this ocotillo, using that as the focal point, at least for the initial part. In the beginning, I started with this guided meditation process, asking them to engage in breath and breathe and connect and quiet their thoughts so that they could be present and in the moment, actively engaging in a mindfulness process through, again, guided meditation. My voice, maybe not the best tool for guided meditation, but that idea of using a few verbal prompts to ask people to see this ocotillo and be aware of themselves in that relationship, that space, that environment. To ask them to look at the helical design of the leaves as they go up the length of these branches, to see and feel both emotionally and physically the spines and spikes that jut out along the length of it, these 1-inch spines that cover the length of the ocotillo. To perceive the red flowers that were at the end of the stalk, some of them 15 feet off the ground, some of them 3 or 4 feet off the ground at the terminus of the branches. So that idea that they were engaging the whole plant, having both a significant and varied visual effect, but also having a finite space there. The idea that it was this one plant that we were looking at, this one ocotillo. In that process then of mindfulness, as we progress through it, I encourage them to engage their senses. And as folks are familiar with, in many cases, when one engages in a mindfulness process, often you recognize an expansion of your senses. The idea that you're that by stepping into your breath and becoming connected with that very basic process, you can experience an expansion of your peripheral vision. You can experience an opening up of your palate. Senses often become more acute and present in your mind, that you can smell, hear, touch, taste things more acutely or focus on them more directly in that mindfulness process. After we'd had a few minutes to do this, I then set a task before the group, asking them to take a journal and spend some time to write down what they were aware of and to see what connection that had for them. What were they aware of in the process of that ocotillo? Were they aware strictly of their senses and being present and enjoying that sort of freedom from me talking or the tasks and assignments that they had, that they were working on, their day-to-day lives, the challenges that we're going through? Were they aware of the spines of the ocotillo and what that sort of overt defense mechanism brought out for them? And or what the green leaves and the bright red flowers might symbolize on the ends of the stalks, so that they were able to be connected and present with that. And in that process, I then set them off on their own to spend that time looking at this and other ocotillos, jotting it down, spending that time by themselves, so that it wasn't an interaction with anybody, peer or therapist. So that's an example of a nature therapy process that I get to engage in here. And you'll notice parts of this are very familiar to your own practice, whether it's the idea of mindfulness and somatic experiencing and talk therapy modules there that are there. But this was using the connection to nature there as an intrinsic part of the process. So mindfulness is something that people have typically a awareness of, either professionally or just in practice and casually. But this idea of enhancing the attention and awareness into the present to get out of your constant rat race mentality of thinking about what's in the future, thinking about other people's perceptions of yourself, to be disconnected from that internal awareness. Mindfulness is this process and tool that we use to bring people into the present and engage that real therapeutic and grounding moment. So mindfulness interventions usually involve guidelines being provided by a facilitator, like specific ritualized beginning and ending. The idea of me doing a guided meditation. But one of the kind of critical awarenesses as a facilitator is this concept of container. And how does one maintain a container in a mindfulness process, both to facilitate trust and acceptance of the modality, to actually allow people to step into it and leave behind whatever those very significant preoccupations and awarenesses are, to allow themselves to be in this moment. That idea of setting a container is so much the the facilitated role of the therapist. And so when you don't have a physical container in the sense of an office or process room or something along those sorts, how do you set a container? Well, in the opportunity to do a guided meditation, me being there and guiding that meditation is one way to set the container. There's in nature therapy, the idea of having some sort of specific and informed process that can be used. So one of the citations that I put on this lecture is about Shinrin Roku, the Japanese forest bathing modality there, which typically does not involve a therapist, but it has a specific location, start time and end time. And so people have a physical awareness of those limitations and refinements kind of thing, so that they are able to feel safe to step into that moment because it has a beginning and end. The example I gave you around the Okatio is one possibility there, but there are many others. That idea of setting a container can be a physical limit, sticking to a trail or sticking to a particular route. It can be a time frame. It can be a task that you're going to need to step into and attain a task of some sort before you can move on to your next phase. So that idea of mindfulness here is something informed by nature, connected to nature, that being present in nature piece allows for a great opportunity to engage in mindfulness. The sensory awareness and enhancement process here is, I think, really dynamic, and eco-psychology and biophilia have a strong connection to evolutionary psychology and how we're connected with the natural world. This idea of us having expanded senses and how we're able to perceive our environment. As one steps into a natural environment, there is that opportunity to bring things in rather than block things out. So we are so attuned to blocking out the noise on the radio, the beeping of our cellular devices, the pop-up ads that appear constantly when you're trying to do something on the internet. And in a natural environment, a natural therapy session, you have that opportunity to actually give yourself the freedom to use all of your senses. People don't think about how the sense of smell and literally blocking that out, or the sense of taste, are things that we don't really connect with an urban environment, typically by choice, a self-care process there. And so by harnessing those senses, we're limiting some of our spectrum of awareness. And so to allow yourself to connect with that is really fantastic and expansive there. And that idea of being in nature, going back to almost a primitive state. I don't want to overemphasize this, but the idea that we can allow ourselves to use all of our senses is a mechanism that has served us well for the evolutionary process. To be aware that something is not right can be a very, very powerful message as well. It's not all about feeling comfortable in nature. Sometimes it's recognizing that the cold is going to impact you, the heat is going to impact you. Spiky spines should not be petted. There's a reason why those have natural protection there, and you should be aware that those sensations, both good and bad, are things that you can honor and respect in the nature therapy awareness. Symbolic projection. So that nature provides many opportunities for different perspectives on the self, resulting in the expansion of one's perceived internal reality that may result in new and more compatible perception, the external reality. So this I find so exciting to be part of the facilitation of, because when people look at nature, when they look at the natural environment, so much of what they see has an immediate and visceral response for them. When you see a dry stream bed, or a withered plant, there's a natural inclination to think about that loss, aging, pain, some of those kind of negative connections there. At the same time, the idea that there are flowers blooming all over the place, that you can see spring green and growing, that you see things struggling mightily against oppressive conditions. Again, I have this wonderful opportunity being here in the Sonoran Desert to have a deeply dynamic environment around me that I can use as a metaphor and model so much, because everything has an overt defense mechanism and everything has managed to scrabble some sort of life out of a harsh environment, an environment that typically gets 2 seasons of rain a year and long periods of time without any perceptible precipitation, means that everything here has got some sort of powerful adaptation. When individuals engage in that same process, seeing a bird calling out and making a hellacious racket just to be noticed, and how they then reflect on that with their personal experience, can be deeply revealing in how one is going to approach therapy and how one is processing their own experience there. The idea with the example of the Ocotillo meditation, people connected with a number of different kind of symbolic messages there. Some of it was the harshness, the ruggedness of the plant. Some of the things was that opportunity to be present in nature was something that they hadn't done since they were a child, and that engaging the inner child process took disconnecting, took that mindful process of separating. And so they saw that freedom of not being encumbered with their thoughts and fears, or social connection, social interdependence, allowed them to experience something, to be present in a way that they hadn't since they were a child. So that symbolic component there, I think, is really cool because of what it evokes as far as responses and awareness from one's individual perspective. And again, connecting it to one's treatment plan. Deep source reservoir for conversation and exposure of what's lying in particular on that subconscious level for individuals. And then the fourth level that I was trying to get at here is the idea of solitude. And this is one of those things that in my normal day-to-day, it seems all too short a time period. But this may be one of those things that one has to titrate for acceptance. People have such difficulty with spending any time literally on their own, that we reach for strangers to make connection with, that we reach for devices to fiddle around on our cell phone, that we reach for our shoelaces or other distractions in order to not have to sit in our own thoughts for any period of time. So much of what I get to see is to remind folks to, you don't need to be doing push-ups just because we're outside. You don't need to be doing exercise. Give yourself that time to just be in your own thoughts, because all those things are distracting from that. There's a long history, and if one was to talk about the prehistory of modern nature therapy, time alone is the absolute pinnacle of kind of that nature in self, the idea of the hermit spending time alone, going into the wilderness in order to seek renewal, the powerful and deep experiences of vision quests and transformational journeys all fit in that model of solitude. But even just 20 minutes with their own thoughts and no distractions can be an incredibly powerful process to illuminate what is most important for folks, and what is most impactful, what is the message that is coming up again and again when they're not distracted, is an incredible tool for that process going forward. So those are some kind of framework for how to utilize nature therapy. I've got some recommended reading here. I highly recommend this new book, Outdoor Therapies. It's a great introduction, covers a lot of different applications. and certainly gives one a sense of kind of the broadness of the field. I don't think it's any sort of guidebook for the direct practice, but the idea of how expansive this field can be to incorporate a variety of different environments, a variety of different awarenesses, both therapeutically and culturally. So recognize this as being a great resource that I'm using these days and using to train others. And then finally, I put together a list of very current articles. So much of nature therapy has been around for a long enough time that most of the research that I find that's contemporary and fits our CE requirements tend to be meta-analysis, allowing one to see effectiveness across different environments and across different practices. There's some really dynamic stuff out there that's been around a long, long time. The practice of Shinrin Yoku is this incredibly powerful modality of forest bathing that I am deeply enamored with. And the idea that one can prescriptively get people to do a practice that is this impactful, to give them the rules and guidelines and get them to engage in something that has, you know, a very specific start and end, a treatment, but that is so often done individually or encouraged to be done individually, I think is really powerful out there. The idea of nature therapy in different environments, urban Great Britain to wilderness United States, a lot of diversity out there. So what are the critical components that connect in with that? So things like bringing outdoor therapies into mainstream mental health is something that I find to be really a useful tool there, in the sense that it's pulling some meta-analysis from different environments. These are all available online and will be in the notes that you guys get. So if anybody wants to check these out, should be able to get a good background there. So I think we're in the time frame for questions. Let me try and turn my camera back on here and put my questions up. So let's see. So is horse-assisted therapy considered within the healing power of nature in any of these approaches? Great question. And as somebody who gets to practice equine therapy occasionally, I think it's an incredibly powerful modality there. There is, if you will, that kind of idea that equine therapy is a great big circle, and the nature part of it is one little blob in that overall experience. One of the things that I find really engaging with individuals in equine therapy is that you ask them, you know, to perceive where they fit into that ecology, right? The idea that horses as herd animals have a certain behavior that's so very different from our classic pets. They're not trying to win you over to get treats the same way because they can graze all day long. The idea that they're going to perceive you from the emotional output that you put in, and then you put that within a context of you're fitting in with that environment. Are you a threat or are you part of the herd? It's never that simple duality, but my goodness, when you ask people to step into that, you get some really cool awarenesses of the natural factor there and how we are perceived in different contexts. Yeah, so equine therapy very much can involve nature therapy, but that's maybe part of the overall picture. Same with adventure therapy that I practice. It doesn't, you know, I really use the power of nature as much as possible, but because of physical limitations, structural limitations, therapeutic goals, we're not always doing adventure therapy in nature. So much of it is, but not 100%. It's one of those kind of connections. What are some other questions here? So are certain settings more impactful than others? obviously. And we would all like to be able to practice in incredibly wild natural settings that just blow our socks off. But I think there's also the awareness of what can we do realistically within the constraints of our practice. You know, our patients, like I get patients coming to me in this setting, so I have that distinct advantage. But that's not always true in different practices. And of course, there's the idea of the very real perceptions that individuals have of different environments. So, you know, when one says desert, I'm thinking of the beautiful adaptations and incredible diversity in this environment. Other people may be thinking inhospitable, and that may be preventing them from stepping into the process because they're so caught up in the threat awareness and the like. And so there is the idea of meeting the therapeutic goals more than anything else. And so some environments, the desert, the ocean, the mountains, are going to have a deep and immediate impact on folks. But I think the power of this is that you can get powerful experiences from you know, a manicured garden and an urban park in so many ways as well, because those have this level of complexity. They have the opportunity for you to recognize and see yourself in nature. And so I think that you know, it's a big spectrum, and different tools for different clients or different intended outcomes is kind of what I'm getting at there. How do I motivate or include reluctant patients? So I think that kind of fits with that same idea. One of the biggest problems I have is this isn't real therapy. We're just spending time in nature. And so it's helpful to talk about some of those four components that I was saying, these deliberate and specific kind of mechanisms by which we approach the process. But there's also then that idea of connecting people so that they see themselves in that environment. One of my favorite activities that I get to do here is to do what we call foraging walks, which have no real target in mind, but I like to walk around and connect people with some of the natural history present in this environment, to show them some edible plants, some natural processes, some of the wonderful adaptive mechanisms that we have. I mean, one takes a look at a cactus and there's so many different things that are going on there. Yes, the spikes are first and foremost in people's mind, and that may be causing there to be a you know, withdrawal, a protection kind of response from folks. But at the same time, the idea that it stores that moisture in its body, that it expands and contracts throughout the day to adapt to climatic conditions, that it can deal with, you know, so much adversity and yet be green and growing. These are wonderful connections that allow people to connect with that space. And then again, that symbolic connection there is something that we can build on, and it can happen in very accessible places, you know, literally garden space and you know, front of the building here, to, you know, going into a space where we're not seeing cars and we're not hearing voices, so that we do feel truly connected and in that space. Yeah. Some other examples of interventions that I do with patients. So that idea of the guided meditation is a great one. The idea of these foraging walks, where we're just kind of asking people to ask questions and to see what's out there. And sometimes there is some answers that are very reductive. You know, this is this Latin name, and it's connected to that. And some of them are much more expansive to you know, wonder how it's managing to survive in you know, dry sand soil with no visible moisture around it, and to just connect with, wow, how does it do it? How do we do it? That's a pretty powerful kind of process there. See if I can hit one more here. So therapeutic impact of the solo experience. This is one of those things that cannot be overstated, and it's just in most of the context of what I get to do so beyond the time frame of what I have. But the idea of the outward bound solo model, that idea of spending 3-4 days alone without any connection with other people, is a transformative process. Working in particular with veterans and first responders, this is something that people have incredible reluctance to engage in, to be alone with their own thoughts. And yet, when one gets to step into that opportunity, the transformative nature of it is mind-blowing. Every opportunity I have for that, both to facilitate much shorter term solo and solitude opportunities, I engage in, but also to make people aware of the processes that they can engage in either on their own or supported outside of the clinical setting, so that they can have some supported, protected time alone. There's programs out there in wilderness therapy that really get to dive into that full force, and I know of no more impactful process than allowing people to sit with their thoughts and avoid distraction. So I think that's the time we have for today. Thanks so much. I know we're going to send out a thank you piece there, but I do want to put up my email address here. If anybody would like to email me with questions, it's christopher.sharp@crtucson.com. Happy to engage other professionals in the field, or just encourage folks to step into this process overall. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.